Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Atlantic Live President Margaret Lowe. Mic is not working. Now mic is working. I'll start over. Anyway, I'm Margaret Lowe. I'm president of Atlantic Live. And as I was just saying, and I will say again, I'm really, really happy to see so many of you here this afternoon. This is our third annual LGBTQ Summit, Unfinished Business. And our purpose here this afternoon is to explore the state of our union and what it means to be LGBTQ in this country and around the world, and to talk about deeply held beliefs and deep divides that still exist. This is clearly unsettled territory, perhaps more unsettled than some of us might have thought just a few years ago. And we've developed a lucky habit with this convening, which is being timely. Last year, we were here just a few days after Donald Trump was elected into the White House and after voters handed Republicans control of Congress. And this year, we're here one day after the Supreme Court heard arguments in a case that pits gay rights against claims of freedom of expression in the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission case. The Colorado baker who refused to make a wedding cake for two men who were about to marry. And this case is viewed as a follow-up to the court's decision 2 years ago affirming same-sex marriage. We're going to hear today from legal experts on both sides of the cake shop case in just a few moments. We've got a lot of ground here to cover on other fronts too, and we always do. We'll talk about where things stand for transgender service members after the president's surprise announcement this past summer on Twitter, banning transgender people from serving in the military. And we'll talk about gay refugees facing persecution around the world, about gays in the grand old party, and about what it means to grow up LGBTQ. Our goal is to make sense of where we are and to understand where we're headed. And before I get started, I do want to say thank you. I want to thank our underwriters, Gilead and Kimpton Mason and Rook Hotel and Radiator, for their support. We're so grateful for that. One additional note, please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away. We're on Twitter at Atlantic Live, and we will hope you'll join the conversation. Use the hashtag AtlanticLGBTQ, and remember, you now have 280 characters to play with. So much more room for substance, so you can go wild. We want you to be part of the conversation in the room, too. We'll leave time for your questions throughout the afternoon. So let's get rolling. Our first two conversations are about the cake shop case. We begin with Rachel Tiven. She's the CEO of Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest legal organization for LGBTQ rights. Lambda Legal filed a friend of the court brief defending the same-sex couple in the cake shop case. And Rachel is here to lead, here with my colleague, Atlantic's executive editor, Matt Thompson, here to lead the conversation. Rachel, Matt, take it away.
Thanks.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So we're basically just going to pick up where the Supreme Court left off yesterday with oral arguments.
Yeah.
Yesterday was just a warm-up, basically,
for
this.
Okay. We're gonna reprise the whole thing.
Whole thing? No. Okay. So a decade and a half ago, case was being made for same-sex marriage, and religious conservatives often opposed it with a slippery slope argument. And they'd say, folks, just you watch. Gays and lesbians won't be satisfied when they can get married. Next, they're going to insist that every pastor has to officiate their weddings, that all photographers have to take photos there. And the many same-sex marriage activists, advocates, were saying in response, no, we just want to get married. This is just about us loving one another. We just want the freedom to be wed. Nothing more. Were they lying?
Well, Lambda kicked off the marriage movement in Hawaii in 1994, so we know a lot about this. There's a really important distinction, right? I mean, I think the question of who's representing the truth accurately is an interesting one, and you'll have lots more time today to talk about it. There is nothing in this case or any other case relating to LGBT people that says that who a minister has to marry in their church, who an imam has to sanctify in their mosque. That is not what this is about, right? My rabbi gets to choose whom he marries and whom he doesn't, and that is absolutely his right. That is the sacred promise of the First Amendment. That's not what this is about. What this is about is commercial conduct. The question is, do we live in a society in which the work of everyday society is open to everybody? That's really what's at stake here.
So, Doc, walking through the particulars of the case in question one more time, a gay couple walks into Jack Phillips' cake shop, Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado, and with a book of cakes, a book of photos, things that they want to have him custom design a cake around, and he says, "I'm sorry, don't make cakes for same-sex weddings." The attorneys for Mr. Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop yesterday made the case that it is not about discriminating against a person, that in fact, that it is all about whether Colorado can insist that this artist has to make a cake out of sugar and flour, has to make a sculpture out of sugar and flour that expresses support for this wedding. They say it's the act of crafting the cake, that creative, expressive act that we're trying to establish. The state can't compel him to make that cake. Now, on the other hand, there's this claim of discrimination, that he's in fact just trying to discriminate against a same-sex couple. And the Alliance Defending Freedom, which argued the case in front of the Supreme Court yesterday, would say that this is not a question of the who, it's a question of the what. And why is that not? Isn't that the case? What's wrong with that argument?
Right. I mean, so first of all, whether or not baking a cake is an artistic expression or a kind of expressive conduct is really beside the point, because this is about public accommodation law, which is content neutral. That means the public accommodations law doesn't tell you what you can sell. It says that whatever you sell, you have to sell it to everybody equally. And you can't discriminate against customers based on the protected classes that are enumerated in the Colorado law, right? So the Colorado law says you can't discriminate against people based on race, based on religion, based on sexual orientation, based on marital status, based on disability, right? These are all things that Colorado says in the law, and there's no asterisk next to sexual orientation, right? I mean, so that's really, that what's at stake here is that ADF would have you believe that you can just put a little asterisk next to sexual orientation and not as to everything, just as to weddings. Don't worry, that's it. But that's, I mean, there's no way to do that without gutting anti-discrimination law.
But the baker in this case says, you know, it's not that I wouldn't sell this couple a wedding cake. There are cakes available in the freezer. They can choose one.
That's not the fact pattern. I mean, that's not what was, right? That is not what was said here. That's a hypothetical as to whether the pre-made cake would be okay, but the cake he is creating with the couple in mind, or what if he didn't know it was for a gay wedding? I mean, these are all hypotheticals, and they were, you know, entertaining yesterday.
So would it be okay?
It's not okay to discriminate against your customers when you're in business.
But would it be okay for him to say, I can't custom design this cake with this message that you want me to have on it, but I'm happy to sell you a wedding cake that's here?
That's first of all, like, that's not what's at issue here, right? What's at issue is, can you say, I don't serve gay people, right? Because again, I think what's important is to say, well, it's not that you're gay, it's that it's a cake for a gay wedding, which is a little bit like, I have nothing against Jews, I just want a tax on yarmulkes. Right? I mean, so that it's a red herring, it's a false distinction.
Okay.
And I just lost my mic.
Yeah. Is there a green light on your pack?
I do. Can you hear me?
All right, we'll project.
Okay. I think that, right, what's important to keep in mind is nothing in this law tells Colorado in the law of Colorado tells the baker what kind of product he can sell. right? It just says, and it doesn't say anything about the way, right? You can make lots of decisions about how you conduct your business. You can decide whether to offer, whether people can pay with credit cards, or these days whether they can pay with cash. Yeah? All right.
Thank you very much. Since my pack seems to be working for the moment, I will.
Thank you.
I'll stick to it.
No?
No?
I feel like the Supreme Court, like, do I get more time? Right, there's nothing that says that you don't have discretion as a business person. You've got discretion over the products you sell and the conduct of your customers when they are in your store, right? You can say no shirt, no shoes, no service.
Right.
But you cannot say no shirt, no shoes, no lesbians.
So, I'm Catholic. To indulge me in another hypothetical, okay. I'm Catholic. Let's say I had any baking talent whatsoever, and that I also was against divorce religiously. Can someone walk into my shop and say, I would like that cake, and I would like it for my divorce party?
Well, under Colorado's law, you can't discriminate based on marital status, so no. But it's hard to see how, if the baker gets an exemption for a gay couple, isn't he equally entitled to an exemption if he says, I'm sorry, until you show me proof of your annulment, I simply cannot provide you a cake.
Okay. So another hypothetical, and along similar lines. There's a group called the Satanic Temple, which likes to troll evangelical Christians who are making claims of religious freedom. They volunteered, actually, to call up Masterpiece Cake Shop and order a satanic cake from this Christian baker, Jack Phillips. Do you believe that Jack Phillips should have to make such a cake?
It depends. I mean, if they are a legitimate religion that is a protected class, the Colorado law would say yes. If they are not a protected class, right, there was a lot of talk yesterday about, do you have to sell things to the Ku Klux Klan? The Ku Klux Klan is not a protected class, at least not yet. And that's right. I mean, you can make lots of choices about the kinds of products you sell, right? You don't have to sell cakes that are vulgar. You don't have to, right there. But the law is very, very clear that expressive conduct of all kinds is not a get-out-of-jail-free card on laws of general applicability, right? Every bakery still has to be inspected by the health department. You still have to pay your taxes, right? And there's lots and lots of case law in which people have said, I have a religious objection to paying my taxes. Or the answer is, if we want to live in a civil society, I mean, Justice Sotomayor said it kind of most clearly and beautifully yesterday. I'm going to quote from her because she said, look, public accommodations law doesn't force you to like people or to approve of them or to invite them into your home. But if you want to be part of our civic community, you can't refuse to sell to people because of their race, their religion, their national origin, and in this case, their sexual orientation.
But what do you say to the baker? What do you say to the person who says, this causes me deep personal pain? I've made this cake. Let's say the cake says, with love, thanks, and support, Matt Thompson's Bakery. And the Satanic Temple has called me up and said, we want to put this cake at the front of our service. And I face the prospect of having this piece of expression that I've crafted for a very different, what I would argue is an expressive, a creative message that I've crafted for a very different purpose. I made it for a friend. And now the state is going to force me to put this cake on display in a context that I deeply
How is the state
with.
forcing you to put the cake on display?
Because if I don't, then I am going to fall afoul of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission.
You have to sell the cake. What happens to it afterward is not relevant.
Well, I have to make the cake.
Yes.
And the state's going to force me to make this cake.
I think here's the question. How is this distinguishable from all of the other kinds of harms that Lambda Legal hears about from people who contact us from all over the country. Every day, our legal help desk takes calls and emails and inquiries from people who have been turned away from a doctor's office because the pediatrician says, I don't believe you're the real parents. Where's the mom and the dad? And so I'm not going to stitch up your kid because I don't believe that you actually can give parental consent. Or the childbirth class, right? These are truly cradle to grave harms. The childbirth class that says, I'm sorry, just this is, that we wouldn't be comfortable with a lesbian couple in the class. Or the funeral home, in the case that we are right now litigating in Mississippi, that turned away the deceased husband of our client. They'd been together for 40 years. And in his, the time that he was most in need, with a prepaid contract with the funeral home, when he signed the paperwork and said that his next of kin was his husband, they said, "I'm sorry, we don't serve your kind here," and they literally left him with his husband's body. So, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? It's really not about cake.
Yeah. Well, so talking about the ripple effects from this decision, whichever way it goes, it feels as though the political dynamics of this are somewhat tricky. So if the Supreme Court rules in accordance with the prior courts, the lower courts, and in line with
every single lower court that has ever addressed this issue.
Duly noted.
Yes.
If they do, Colorado is one of a minority of states that have an anti-discrimination act in place, an anti-discrimination law in place. And every other state that does not, the majority of states that lack such a law on the books, all of a sudden, every religious conservative is going to say, look what happened in Colorado. Why would we pass an anti-discrimination act here if we are going to face the same impasse, if our bakers are going to face the same dilemma in our state's stores?
I'm delighted to hear that they were on the verge. I didn't.
But doesn't that present a tricky dynamic for this outcome, whichever way it goes?
I think the tricky dynamic for the outcome is what happens when the country wakes up to find that its anti-discrimination laws have been gutted by an exemption that is limitless, right? I mean, if the Supreme Court says that if you believe that you need not treat your customers equally, you are free to discriminate against them, right? And you may discriminate against them on any basis. Again, it is impossible to see how you could carve an exception for gays only or for wedding-related services, right? I mean, Justice Kagan asked a series of very pointed questions about how would you limit this only to gays, right, and not to race or to religion or to national origin? How would you limit it to weddings alone, right? What about bar mitzvahs or First Holy Communion or birthday parties, or, right? I mean, the kinds of things that Lambda's help desk hears about are, they didn't want to do my kid's birthday party because they said that families like ours aren't welcome. I mean, this is what's happening to people every day.
So one of the ways in which the court might prospectively rule narrowly would be to say that in general, we want to support the principle of non-discrimination, but Colorado's Civil Rights Commission went a bit too far. So one of the arguments that the petitioners made yesterday and in their briefs was that part of the commission's findings in Colorado were, among those requirements was, one, to conduct comprehensive training. Jack Phillips had to was ordered to conduct comprehensive training on discrimination and non-discriminatory behavior for his employees. And they're arguing, even if you deny that construction of a cake is not a speech act that should be protected, then certainly conducting training, instructing employees, saying, okay, I believe this type of thing, and maybe we can't say that in the shop, that might be limiting of freedom of speech in a perilous way.
You just have to treat all your customers equally. You don't have to like them.
But you have to create, what if if you're ordered to do training? Does that not go too far, perhaps?
I mean, we are ordered to do training to make sure that the health inspector is satisfied that they do proper food handling, right? If it is a law of general applicability, it's a law of general applicability. I think the thing to keep in mind here is we pass anti-discrimination law because not everybody is comfortable treating people the same, right? If everyone were okay with recognizing my full humanity and yours, we wouldn't need these laws. So I think that's where we are, and I think really the question is, what kind of society do we want to live in? And do we want to live in a society where every commercial transaction involves the proprietor's judgment about your life and how you live it? Or do we want to live in a civic community, as Justice Sotomayor said, where we all participate? We might have private thoughts about one another, but we don't let them, we don't let those things infringe on how we treat one another in the marketplace.
I have so many more questions for you, Rachel. I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one more, but I'd like to take a couple from the audience. And of course, I'm staring you down, and if the question lasts 30 seconds and is actually a speech, then we are all going to give you side eye. All of us. All of us. Where's the... A microphone's on its way. Yeah. This one I bet will work.
Okay. Oh, you want me to stand? I'll stand up. Okay. This will be less than 30 seconds, but rather than political, it's going to be a lawyerly question, probably because I'm a lawyer. So one fact, Rachel, I want to know is, did they ask for a message to be put on the cake? Did they want words on the cake or just flowers?
No. In this case, they didn't. I mean, the exchange was very brief, and there was no discussion of the substance of what they were ordering.
Which I think is what makes it entirely different from your example about with love from Matt that you made for your cousin, because that is attributing a certain point of view to you, and everybody will know who the speaker is, and that's why this is not a First Amendment issue at all.
Well, we'll talk a lot more about this in a moment. One more question over here.
I usually sit it down and then I kick it.
I'm a professor at the University of Colorado Law School. So it's interesting because you asked a question to begin with as to whether there's a difference between a pre-made cake and a cake custom-made for the couple. And in the court this came up, and she said, well, a custom-made cake gets special protections. But to me it seems bizarre because the custom-made cake is the couple's speech. Right, it's not the baker's speech.
Remember the speech. Remember my speech proviso. What's your question?
And so I guess the question is: do you actually see the custom-made cake as being less protected or more protected, given that the custom-made cake would actually be the baker's speech more than a pre-made cake would be the baker's speech more than the custom-made cake?
I think it's a distinction without a difference, right? I mean, I think that the case law is so clear that all kinds of things that are far more expressive, right? I mean, a terrific case that you know from 1984, in which the expressive work that a law firm conducts and their desire to only have men as partners in the law firm is not protection from the sex discrimination requirements of Title VII, right? You can't use expressive conduct, even if this is expressive conduct, as a shield from neutral laws of general applicability.
So Rachel, one more question for you. Our friends on the other side of this argument will get the last word, so I'd like to ask you, what would you like to ask our friends from the Alliance Defending Freedom, if you had one question?
Since yesterday, neither their attorney nor nobody answered the question conclusively, or at all, really, as to what the difference is between this cake and this Freudian slip, this case, and for example, the Piggy Park case, right? This is the barbecue joint in which the proprietor was very clear that his religious belief was against race mixing, and that was why he would not integrate his restaurant. And the Supreme Court was utterly dismissive of that at a time when that was not not an unheard of argument. I mean, they could understand the context in which he was making that argument, and this was a devoted white supremacist his entire life. Died in 2014, never having apparently changed his views. He said, this was his religious belief. And they said, nothing doing. You still have to follow the law. So how is this different than that?
Thank you very much, Rachel Tibbin.
Next up, a look at the plaintiff's perspective in the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission Supreme Court case. Joining Matt Thompson, please welcome Baronelle Stutzman, who owns and operates Arlene's Flowers, and Jim Campbell, Senior Counsel at the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Baronelle, Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
You may have noticed we are off of 14th Street where the rainbow flag flies all year round here. We are next to the Whitman Walker Health Clinic. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to a thoughtful conversation. It's an important one.
Sure.
I will start actually with a version of Rachel's last question. In yesterday's oral arguments, we did keep hearing, and particularly Justice Sotomayor kept on pressing on this question. Where is the line? If the case will be made about freedom of expression, if the case is that crafting this custom design, this sculpture made of flour and sugar, is an expressive act that should be protected, then what act of commerce is not a creative act? What act of commerce is not an expressive act that should be protected? What is the answer to that question? What distinguishes particularly a custom-designed cake, baking a custom-designed cake, from a chef making a delicious plate of barbecue?
Sure. The first thing I think that's important to point out is that the First Amendment itself protects speech. We didn't invent the fact that the First Amendment protects speech and expression. And so the question is,
what is speech?
What is speech? And so the Supreme Court has looked at a number of things over the years. The Supreme Court has looked at, does it express something? But also, is it analogous to something that the court has already recognized as protected speech? And so those are some factors that we think are at play in this case. And so when you're making a custom wedding cake, a multi-tiered, highly stylized cake, we do believe that it is akin to a sculpture. Obviously, it's made of flour, as you said, but it is something that is highly stylized and is made to celebrate a particular event. And so that's one thing courts look to. And other things courts look to is they look to whether the primary purpose is expressive and artistic or whether the primary purpose is functional or utilitarian.
But reasonable people can disagree about that, can't they? And both of those questions. I walk into Jose Andres' restaurant and he has crafted for me this plate, this dish that's on offer on the menu that is this masterpiece of, it's an aioli and it expresses longing and regret. And I ask for that cake on a date with my partner, and he says, "I'm sorry, I don't think that I can serve you this dish." How would that not be a protected act?
I simply don't see how serving food is expressive, and I think that is very different from the creation of a custom cake, the creation of a custom cake to celebrate a marriage. But it also is important to keep in mind that, this case we have two First Amendment claims. And so the one that we're talking about is the freedom of expression, artistic freedom claim, but there's also a claim involving free exercise of religion. And so that's another claim that's important and is at the heart of this case.
We'll come back to that one. Baronelle, now you own a flower shop.
Yes, sir.
In Washington State, Arlene's Flowers. And you've made a similar argument about the act of crafting a flower arrangement. And I want to walk through a scenario with you. So I walk into your shop with a photograph of a bouquet, a gorgeous bouquet that you crafted for my dear friend's wedding. And I say, "Baronelle, please make me one of these for my wedding." What happens next?
Well, I sit down with you. I find out.
Oh,
Sorry, talk really soft.
is the microphone off in this case also?
Hello. Hello.
All right, try this one.
Testing 1, 2. Okay. Better. Okay. I sit down with you. And you're a bride, and I find out all about you. I find out how you met. I find out what colors you like. I find out how you got engaged. How you want to what do you want the message to be in your wedding? I found out your favorite flowers. I spend weeks, sometimes years, with you planning this, and then once that's done, and I make your bouquet. Then I go to the wedding, and I service the wedding. I help the bride get dressed. Sometimes also a button on a tux. I greet the guest. I calm the parents, and then I have the bride and groom walk down the aisle.
That sounds lovely. Forget the bride for a moment. I don't need the tux service, but I just want the bouquet. It's beautiful, and I just want one of these at my wedding. Can you make one for me?
Yes, if the marriage is between a man and a woman, I can. Because my faith teaches me that marriage is between a man and a woman. It has nothing to do with the person or the sexual orientation. It has to do with my faith.
But why do I have to volunteer that information, Baronel? Can I not buy the bouquet, merely ask you to craft me this beautiful sculpture in service of love? Oh, one moment.
Well, excuse us. Okay.
Why must I out myself to purchase this arrangement?
Well, I think what's important in this case, and when we're talking about Baronel's case, I think it's important that we stick to the facts of her case, which is she had served this gentleman for 9 years. She considered him a friend. They had worked together, and this was something that when he came in and asked her to create the custom arrangements for her for his wedding, it was something that she knew the circumstances, and so I think that your situation is different.
Well, okay, so yesterday in an interview with, the Daily published an interview with Jack Phillips, and he described the fateful interaction at Masterpiece Cake Shop this way. He said, 2 gentlemen came into my shop. They had a folder with them and had my wedding books open, and so I went over and sat down with them, introduced myself, we exchanged names, and they said, we're here to look for wedding cakes, and it's for our wedding. And so I tried to respectfully explain to them that, I'm sorry guys, I don't do cakes for same-sex weddings. That was the encounter as he described it. And in that encounter, the couple revealed themselves. That encounter, what he described, and the thing that led him to say, I'm sorry, I won't make this cake for you, was not a, what would you like the cake to be question. It was a, who is this cake for question. And that's the question that you would have asked me, Baronel, in our hypothetical exchange. Well, tell me about your bride. That sounds very much like a who you are question. It sounds like you're asking a question so that you can make a decision about what type of customer you want to serve. And how is that not the case?
Sure, I would disagree with that because it's a question of what am I being asked to create art to celebrate. It's a question of tell me about this event that I'm going to be putting my heart and my soul and my artistic expression into.
But why is that important if you've made this beautiful arrangement? If I'm not asking you to say anything particular, I'm fine with the message. I merely want this gorgeous thing that you have made, this gorgeous floral sculpture that you have put into the world.
Well, I think what's important there is that context matters. Context changes the meaning of things. And so if you're celebrating one event, you're celebrating one message, versus if you're celebrating another event, it's a different message.
So if this case enshrines the standard that you're hoping it does, what is to prevent all sorts of businesses from declining to serve an LGBTQ clientele? So who's to say that lawyers, for example, wouldn't be able to serve gay, lesbian, bi, trans individuals?
So the test that we've put to the court, we believe is very clear. The first question is there speech? And we've talked about that already. But the second question is the reason why you're declining this request because of the message of the speech or because of the person who's asking it? And so if somebody just says, well, what I do is speech, but I refuse to speak for all African Americans, or I refuse to speak for all women, that is something that wouldn't be protected under our theory because that is a person-based objection. Our theory only would protect a message-based objection.
Jim, has the Alliance Defense Fund, your organization, campaigned against the American Bar Association's anti-discrimination rule on the grounds that it would censor lawyers' speech?
So there's a proposed rule. It's Rule 8.4 of the bar, of the ABA's model code, And I don't know exactly all the positions that we've taken, but I do know that we're very concerned that it would require lawyers to take cases and advocate for causes that would violate their convictions. And that's something that's deeply unsettling, not only to our legal organization, but a lot of legal organizations. But that's, again, I think the key point is, it's different to say, I don't want to advocate for a cause, than to say, I don't want to represent an individual. And that's the concern that we have.
But isn't that another indication of anti-discrimination? So one argument that's being made here is that what is under attack, what is under threat in this case, is actually the principle of anti-discrimination laws. That Colorado has made this choice to enshrine. It has selected as a state. It has said, we would like to establish a principle that says that our businesses can't discriminate against any clients on the basis of their sexual orientation. And in that context and in this, if the ADF is against anti-discrimination rules, then what does that suggest for anti-discrimination and for your beliefs about discriminatory behavior?
I think it's wrong to say that the ADF is against anti-discrimination. I think the ADF is against an overexpanded reading that would force people to speak messages and to promote ideas that conflict with their beliefs. And so in this case, again, the argument that we're making would not allow any kind of person-based discrimination. It would only allow what we call message-based decisions that say, this is not a message that I want to promote. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind about these cases, and you said, you were talking about what's at stake. Well, one of the principles that's at stake is, what are we going to do with people like Baronell and like Jack Phillips who believe that marriage is a union of a man and a woman? Are we going to take them as part of society and to force them to the margins and not welcome them in public life? Or are we going to allow them to live out their beliefs? And I would like to find, I would like to believe that we can find a compromise on that.
One moderator for this interview, if you would. You'll get a chance to ask some questions. Baronell.
May I tell you about my relationship with Rob?
Please do.
Okay. Rob is one of my favorite customers. I waited for Rob for almost 10 years. I knew Rob was gay. It was never an issue. What I liked about Rob was his creativity and his imagination. And one of the things that really drew us together was the way he treated his employees and his staff. And I thought that was so great because he was always so gracious to them. I custom designed flowers for Rob for anniversaries, for birthdays, for parties. And he would always come in and pick out a different vase, a usual container, and he'd say, do your thing, which I love because I got to work out of the box and make something really different and unique for him. He loved my arrangements, and I loved doing them for Rob. He had been in a couple times before and told the girls that he was getting married and he wanted to talk to me. So when I found that out, I went home and I talked to my husband, and I said, what do we do here? I don't want to hurt Rob's feelings. I think the world of him. How do I graciously tell him that I cannot do his wedding because of my faith? So when Rob came in to talk to me about his wedding, before he got too far, I just put my hands on Rob's and I said, Rob, I'm sorry. I can't do your wedding because of my relationship with Jesus Christ. He said, I understand. He said, my mom feels that way. I'm hoping she'll walk me down the aisle. We talked about how we got engaged, why they decided to be married. We talked for a while. He asked me if I would recommend another florist, which I did 3, which I knew would do him a good job. And Robin and I hugged each other, and he left. His partner put something on Facebook that basically said, I have every right to believe the way I do, but I hurt their feelings. The Washington State Attorney General picked that up off of social media without any complaint from Robin Kurd. Sent me a letter saying, you will do same-sex marriages, you will donate $5,000 to the gay and lesbian youth group, and I'll forget the whole thing. The ACLU got a hold of Rob and Kurt, and they also sued us personally and corporately. If Rob walked into my shop tomorrow, I would hug him, catch up on his life, and wait on him for another 10 years. I miss Rob, and I never intended to hurt him in any way. Rob and Kurt have every right to live the way they consistently feel and with their faith. And I am only asking for the same thing.
Now, Baronell, I respect the depth of that expression and the depth of that belief. At the same time, my mind harkens back to a few decades ago in one of the lower court rulings leading up to Loving versus Virginia. There was an individual in the case. One of the trial lawyers argued the almighty God, he created the races, yellow, black, red, and Malay, because it was a different time. He said, I don't believe, earnestly, there are people who do not believe in miscegenation, in interracial marriage. And so, why should I, at my lunch counter, be forced, be compelled to serve a black and white couple a meal that I have crafted with my hands? And do you agree, do you believe that that restaurant owner should not have to serve that meal?
That strikes me as a
question. I would love, Baronel, I would love to hear.
Well, Baronel's here to tell her story, and the legal questions, I'm here to answer those.
But this was a question about belief, though. And Baronel, you just told us a story about belief, and I'm curious how you feel about that scenario.
In this situation, I think it's pretty clear. All
right, mansplain for me, Jim. Come on, let's do it.
So our position in this litigation has always been that opposition to interracial marriage is an opposition to the race of the individuals. A belief that marriage is a union of a man and a woman is not based at all on animosity towards anyone in the gay or lesbian community. It's simply a belief that people throughout generations have held, including people in the Judeo-Christian tradition,
Jim,
the Muslim tradition.
I would love, though, in that scenario, if I am a cook and I believe that this creative act of making a meal, which is creative, that it would violate my religious expression, my religious belief, and my freedom of expression, then do you believe that should not be compelled by the state?
We, as I laid out before, our theory is that it only protects decisions that are not based on who a person is. And in this instance, the example you gave, I believe that's based on who a person is and what their race is. In the circumstances of Baronel's and Jack's case, they're happy to serve everyone. They just can't do something that celebrates a view of marriage in conflict with their faith.
So let me ask you another line of questioning that is more fully in the legal domain. So Justice Scalia, may he rest in peace, in Lawrence, in Windsor, in Obergefell, in the cases that have built the foundation for same-sex marriage, Scalia consistently said, the states have made a choice. They have crafted laws. In our laboratory in the United States, in America's laboratory of democracy, they have crafted laws that express what each state believes it should be the case, should be the standard. And shouldn't the states be allowed to have those standards? Shouldn't those standards be protected by the federal government? And shouldn't the federal government take very seriously intruding on a standard that the state has decided that it stands behind? And in this case, hasn't the state of Colorado decided to stand behind the principle of non-discrimination as the state defines it, including sexual orientation? And why should that be contravened by the Supreme Court?
Well, I think because there's First Amendment rights, and First Amendment rights can't be trumped by state laws. And so an example would be in the Obergefell case, that was advocating for same-sex marriage. One of the arguments that the states made was exactly what you talked about, which is we should allow states to sort this out for themselves. But the response for the same-sex couples who were bringing those cases was that you can't allow states' decisions to override constitutional rights, and that's exactly what we're arguing here.
So I can keep going, but I would like to allow a couple questions from the audience.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Sarah Massey, and I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community. Thank you. And I just want to make sure that everyone in this room knows this, and everyone watching live knows this. The Alliance Defending Freedom is a hate group.
Sarah, please question.
I'm asking a question. This has been designated by the Southern Poverty
Sarah,
Law Center.
Please, your question.
I'm asking, why is this organization prominently attacking LGBTQ Americans? Thank you.
And I would say that, Sarah, we're not attacking anyone. We're standing up for the rights of individuals of all faiths to live out their beliefs.
A question over here. Oh, sorry, question over here.
Thank you. My question is this. I respect your religious opinion. I'm unaware of anything that Christ has said about gay marriage. But if you're citing Old Testament, like Deuteronomy, what other prescriptions in the Bible that would you refuse to service people? Would you, for say, refuse to make flowers for a woman who fails to be submissive to her husband?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
All right, so what other prescriptions in the Bible would you fail, or would you use to deny service to a customer? Such as, would you fail to, or would you deny making flowers for a woman who fails to be submissive to her husband?
I didn't deny anybody's service at any time. I waited for Rob for almost 10 years. It's not the service I deny, it's the event.
So I want to ask, come back to the question that I began this with, where's the line? But Baronel, I want to point this question at you. A big part of the arguments yesterday, our colleague Kristen Wagoner, who made the arguments before the Supreme Court, said that really it is the construction of this distinctive sculpture that is protected in this case. It would not be a pre-made bouquet. It does not apply to cooks. It doesn't even apply to makeup artists. Now, Baronel, within your craft, is there a line? How would you articulate the line between a creative act, an act of expression, and a product that you've made?
Well, if you come in for a birthday bouquet or an anniversary bouquet or whatever type of bouquet, that's fine. I'm not there to judge you, nor am I there to judge Rob and Kurt. But when I create something that is you, like in funeral work, when somebody passes away and I find out about their grandfather, he liked to fish or he liked to hunt, then I make that sympathy piece with a fishing pond or fishing pole and a fishing pond with a fish. That's Grandpa. And when they can come in and look at that and go, they burst into tears, they go, that's Grandpa, then that's what I create. And that's what I create for bride and groom, is something that expresses them.
And one thing Baronel's always been clear about in her case is that she's happy to sell, it's similar to in the Masterpiece case, she's happy to sell all her pre-made stuff to anyone. That's never been a question.
Well, Baronel, Jim, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Joining us.
Thanks for
having us.
Thanks for having us.
Our next conversation takes a look at the stories and statistics behind growing up LGBTQ. We're joined by Caitlin Ryan, the director of the Family Acceptance Project, Sam Brinton, the head of advocacy and government affairs at the Trevor Project, and Maren Greathouse, the director of the Tyler Clementi Center at Rutgers University. And here to lead the conversation is Allison Stewart, contributing editor for The Atlantic.
Hey everybody. How are mics doing? Good? We're doing okay?
Are we good? Yep.
Great.
Whoa.
Okay, so we all remember growing up. It was exciting and confusing, and we looked for support and help. And our panelists here today are going to help us understand what it's like to grow up in 2017. And I think also, Dr. Ryan, you're going to help us understand what it's been like over the course of decades, because you've been doing this work for a long time. But just so our audience understands, sorry for you folks at my back, you folks, so people understand the work you do, I want each of you to briefly explain the focus of the organization you work for and with, and the single biggest issue that really vexes you, that really kind of keeps you up at night when you think about the work you do. Dr. Ryan?
I'm the director of the Family Acceptance Project at San Francisco State University. We are the first research, education, intervention, and policy project that was developed 15 years ago this year to help ethnically, culturally, religiously diverse families learn to support their LGBT children to reduce serious health risks and increase well-being. Like all of us, funding is an enormous challenge. And also in this information age, so much information is moving so quickly and there are so many issues, and the needs of families and LGBT young people are enormous. They're coming out at much younger ages, and really getting the resources out there to help them before those young people are ejected from their homes or really negative outcomes occur. That is a compelling challenge.
Yeah.
How about for you, Sam?
Yeah, so my name is Sam Brinton. I'm our head of advocacy and government affairs at the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is the nation's largest and accredited suicide prevention and crisis intervention program. So we serve roughly 200,000 LGBTQ youth who call us in crisis or in suicidal ideation every single year. So it's a very demanding job, as one can expect. Something that keeps me up at night, I guess, and what I've basically thrown my entire life's passion into is ending the horrible, dangerous, and discredited practice of conversion therapy. So I was put through conversion therapy as a child, and we get calls every single week of children who are about to be put into conversion therapy, are in it, or are coming out of it. So we have a lot of work to do to protect the erasure of our people. That's all I can describe conversion therapy as, is the idea that we don't have to even exist, and it's legal in 41 states. So we have a lot of work left to do.
All right, we'll talk a lot about that as well. And Maren.
So I'm Maren Greathouse. I'm director of the Tyler Clementi Center at Rutgers University. The center was named after Tyler Clementi, a student who committed suicide in 2010 at our institution. And for those of you who don't know the story, was a victim of cyberbullying by his roommate for freshman year. And so I guess the one thing that vexes me is I would probably say funding as well. A lack of funding for LGBTQ research, and just the lack of LGBTQ resources on college campuses around the country. So only about 15% of colleges have dedicated faculty or staff who serve that population.
Okay. Dr. Ryan, I listened to a couple of interviews and speeches you've given, and you said that the cornerstone for youth as they're recognizing their sexual orientation is family, faith, and schools. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of each one and what that would look like in a perfect world, and then the reality of what you're dealing with each of those when you're talking to kids and you're dealing with families?
Well, I could speak for an hour on that.
All right, you got it. I'm going to give you 3 minutes on that one.
Family is the basic unit across all social worlds, all around the world. And when we started the Family Acceptance Project, no one had ever studied what happens in families when children are found to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. So even though there were a lot of perceptions, and the perceptions were that all families were rejecting, I knew that wasn't the case because 35 years ago, at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, I was working with very diverse young people in the South. I helped start the first AIDS organization. I worked with many families, African American families, other families who would have done anything to change the future for their children when they met them at their deathbed. When they found out, so often for the first time, that that young person was gay or bisexual and was dying of AIDS. And I knew then that we had to do something different, that we had to really present this information about sexual orientation and diversity in a way that parents could understand it. So families are linked, obviously, to faith as another cornerstone in schools, but those are also the 3 primary institutions that socialize children in our society. And enormous work was needed to be done in schools because of bullying, which still happens, but so much of it happens in the school themselves. And it's the values of the parents that are really being expressed by the children when bullying occurs. So if we're not working on a community level to change knowledge and understanding and address attitudes, we're really not getting at the underlying issues of how does discrimination occur. And faith, so many families, faith dictates how they think about things or how they approach things. And because there had been this enormous, I would say, chasm between very religious people and gay people for so long because of beliefs about homosexuality and doctrine, there wasn't really a place to bring all of those together. So in our work, we really wanted to focus on how do we address these major social institutions, how do we guide families, how do we really present information in a way that's culturally relevant? Because if you can't talk about what it means to be LGBT across the kitchen table, or if you can't talk about it in your congregation or in a way that the people who are part of your life really understand it, then what are we really doing? Because if we've made our lives so technical or so complex that we have to have a dictionary to talk about our identities, we're really not meeting families where they are. And this is part of the problem, I think.
How do you build the bridges for families where there is a deep-seated faith? Because you can have logic, but there's something about faith that it is just visceral with people. How do you build that bridge? What are the tools you can use?
Absolutely. Well, for those of you who might be familiar with our work, some of you may be, but we've actually done the first research that's looked at a whole range of behaviors that families engaged in to accept or reject their LGBT children. And those behaviors range from trying to change your child's sexual orientation to making them pray or attend religious services to alter who they are versus finding a positive role model to give them a sense of the future. So we approach this as a health issue. It's not a moral issue. And I think for so many conversations, it's been about morality, and you're never going to go beyond that. Because what is the greatest morality of parents and caregivers but to support their children's well-being and to care for them and nurture them, and also to keep their families together. So what we've done is to overlay the findings of our research on cultural foundations. So we work with families from all different kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds. We've worked across languages, across literacy issues, and we're really framing our findings in a way that resonate for them to show them that they can support that gay or transgender child, or however that child identifies, even if they believe that being gay or transgender is wrong. And that's the first door that they can begin to walk through, and it does it in a cultural framework. And I think that's essential if we're going to engage families that are in particular very rejected.
Sam, something that's always written about you, but it's always in the last paragraph, so I want to put it in the first paragraph of this conversation, is that you are a graduate of MIT with a dual master's in nuclear engineering and technology and policy.
Yeah, I'm a nuclear physicist. Yep, exactly.
Since we're talking about when we were kids, did you always know you wanted to be a nuclear physicist? Were you a math?
Okay, this is a really interesting story. I love that I get to tell this story here. So I actually chose nuclear engineering because my parents wanted me to go to Pensacola Christian College, a very strong conservative Christian college. So I did the Choose Your Major book and went down to the letter, I got all the way down to the letter N, that they had all these majors available, and I found nuclear engineering. I was like, oh, I've always wanted to be a nuclear engineer. That way I didn't have to go to the very school that my parents wanted me to go to. So, and it worked out well. It worked really well. I love it. I talk all the time how it's this perfect combination of community where a nuclear engineer, I'm almost always the only one in the room. Well, in LGBT spaces, I'm typically very rare. I'm constantly dealing with misperception, whether it's Glee for LGBT issues or Homer Simpson for nuclear issues. I'm constantly, oh, you've heard about this before. Let's figure out what reality is. And then there's this concept of lack of information. I'm very empathetic to, oh, you're not necessarily going to understand where I'm coming from, and that's okay, because most people don't. So let's figure out a way that what do we understand together and go from there.
Your folks you work with, what do they think about your advocacy?
I have found that we, as an LGBT community, are really great at getting to something and celebrating it for that moment and then leaving it behind. And the biggest issue for me is obviously, so I was put through conversion therapy as a child, right? And I fight because we need every single state to fight to ban conversion therapy. This is not going to happen in one click in federal with the Supreme Court even. You have to recognize that every state controls this issue, and that's why from Kansas to New York to California, it has to be stopped altogether.
From your personal story, do you remember that moment when, what was the catalyst for you having to go to this therapy?
Yeah, so...
Therapy quotes.
Therapy in quotes. So I talk about my experiences in real brief, which is I was raised by Southern Baptist missionaries and am still a devout Baptist. I love my faith. And when in that mission commune, we found a Playboy in the trash. I'm not going to comment how a Playboy was found in the trash of a mission commune, but when we found that Playboy, I moved from VeggieTales to Playboy in an afternoon. And that sex ed was so overwhelming to me that I literally thought myself so holy and righteous that it didn't affect me. So I immediately went and told my friends. I was like, look at me, I'm so holy. Like, they were all lusting after Miss America. But like, I, however, had no problems with this. My dad would comment and ask, like, well, do you ever have these feelings? I said, yeah, I do have those feelings sometimes. And I literally didn't realize I was coming out. I said, yeah, I have those feelings sometimes when I think about Dale. Dale was this gorgeous high school boy with like ripped abs. I was like, Miss America got nothing on Dale, right? And so that was like my life. And my father didn't take it quite as happily. He would come toward me, and I would wake up in the emergency room. My father had punched me so hard that I had been knocked out cold. When punching me didn't work, my mom stepped in and said, let's try this thing called conversion therapy. It seems to be more healthy than just hitting our child. And that was the beginning of a really horrific experience of ice and heat and electroshock, all to an 11-year-old child who was screaming, make it stop, but didn't know what was wrong with him.
When did it stop?
It stopped when I finally lied, and I said that I had changed because I was on my 4th suicide attempt, and I couldn't deal with it anymore. And so I told my parents that I was straight to make it all stop, because I realized it was a lie to God, but that lie was going to save my life. And so it worked for a while. I would go to Kansas State University. There was no LGBT resource center in the entire state, and so I found out later from a friend that she was gay, and all of a sudden realized that I wasn't the only one, and founded the first LGBT resource center in the state there in Kansas, and then literally just started, yes, go Kansas, and then just started all this work, seeing no one should have to go through what I went through. This is legal, and for thousands, and Caitlin can attest, like thousands of children go through this. And we don't think it's happening anymore.
Mary, I'm going to get to you next, but I do need to ask this one question, because if people go Google you, Sam,
Yes.
you know this.
Yes.
There's a few videos that question that this even happened to you. There are people who don't believe this.
Yep.
So for someone who Googles you today and wants to know more about you, what do you say to those folks who have questions about your timeline and whether this actually happened to you?
Absolutely. So the most important thing you need to remember is that I don't give a lot of details exactly about my therapist, because the trauma of actually describing my therapist in person is horrific. I have horrible seizures. I just got engaged 2 months ago, and thank you. And the first kiss to Kevin made me puke. So if you can't, because of the pain of what I was going through. So to those people, I say, I recognize that you don't have to recognize my story. Thousands of people have. It's been verified by many, many press organizations. But I recognize that it's my story to tell, not your story to hear. So if it's my experiences, then you need to recognize that if you want to find another experience to have this story be more applicable to you, go and find those survivors, because we exist everywhere.
Maren, I want to talk to you about this Rutgers study, which has been billed as the largest analysis of LGBTQ college students. You've done this enormous study. How many students, how many schools, what was the geographic makeup?
So we did a meta-analysis of 4 national data sets that collect data on over 300,000 students a year. And we had about 80,000 students, about 72,000 LGBTQ students, and about 9,000 transgender students that were part of the sample that we looked at, which was pretty remarkable, because most studies, range between 100 and 1,000 students, the largest one being about 5,000 students. So this was a tremendously large sample to be looking at.
What were the 3 findings that jumped out at you?
Well, I think the most disturbing finding was that LGBTQ students were about 3 times more likely to experience debilitating depression. They had 3 times the self-injury rate. And roughly half of these students, somewhere between 30 and 50% of students, had seriously considered suicide in the last year. So, the health outcomes that we found were really alarming. But some of the interesting findings that we found regarding academic outcomes is that LGBTQ students are very underrepresented in STEM. They have the same GPA as heterosexual and cisgender students when we looked at 2 of our data sets. And so, they're doing well academically, but the number of students who report a consideration of dropping out was much higher among LGBTQ students than their counterparts.
So the impact on their education, the whole reason they're there, is extraordinary.
Yes, definitely. Well, and it's kind of amazing when you think about the health outcomes, yet they're still achieving the same GPA as their counterparts. I wonder what they could do if they didn't have all of those mental health issues that were disrupting them.
I'm going to go to the audience in about 1 minute for questions. Something that I'm interested in, because when you're a kid, you learn sex ed, right? I want to get your take on the way sex ed is taught now and how you think it should be taught. Caitlin?
Wow. it's not being taught in so many places. And if you're an LGBT young person, the first thing you would say is, nothing that's said in this class relates to me. And there are states, and I'm sure Sam is very familiar with them, that don't allow sex education at all.
Correct.
In fact, there are states where you can't even use the word homosexuality. And many of the counselors in those states, school counselors, have come to me in tears. What can I do with my students? How can I help them? How can I be supportive of them? This is a big problem, and it's something that I particularly worry about now in this current environment when we're seeing so many losses on so many fronts related to human development.
That's true. I just have to add as well, the complexity of sex ed means that people like myself who identify as gender fluid are consistently left out even of the most progressive issues. So that's been something that I've been really, really interested in is, even with the best sex ed, there's always more to be done. There's always going to be another community that we're needing to make sure we recognize and provide some stability, because there is no, if my parents, if I would have come out to them as gender fluid and they would have had to look it up, there's no major national resources on this. There's no major conversation going on. So what's a parent to do when the school won't let them teach? Where's the next step? So figuring out gender issues is going to be really critical as well.
On the level of higher education, what can be done to be more inclusive? Obviously, sex ed's probably, people know about it by the time they get to college, but in other ways.
Well, I think more universities need to establish LGBT resources and have dedicated staff whose, at least 50% of their job is serving this population, because these students are so vulnerable and they're coming in so vulnerable, so that, from the very moment they step on campus, they need competent health care, competent behavioral health services, policies that include them, and resources that consider them, campus programming that talks to them, housing facilities that accommodate their needs. And I think for these students, they really just want to be counted.
Want to matter.
Yeah.
All right, let's take some questions right here.
Hi, my name is Kathy Renna. My question is about the age of coming out and how that has decreased significantly in the last decade, and where you think we need to start doing the work with parents and schools and faith communities to really start to address these issues realistically.
Well, the age of coming out has dropped dramatically. If we look at the 70s, research studies showed late teens, early 20s for people who came out. Many never did. If you fast forward to the early 90s, already on average young people were coming out between 14 and 16. And if you go even more into the present, young people now are coming out at 6 or 7 with whatever language they're using to identify some kind of a sexual orientation, and they're being identified by others as not only gender diverse, but transgender, or they're saying at age 3 or 4, if they can talk, my body is different than my sense of gender. The big problem is we don't have the resources in place, the services in place, to help families from all different kinds of backgrounds learn to support their LGBT child. I've been advocating for education about sexual orientation and gender identity as part of well baby care and pediatric visits and anticipatory guidance for health and mental health providers. Because if parents understand what this is when their children are little, it's really going to help, I think, decrease the kinds of conflict that occurs when they're coming out later on and the parents don't understand it at all.
And when you don't have those parents, we have suicidal ideation. We're getting calls at Trevor Project of 7 and 8-year-olds. That's horrific to me to think of, but if you do not have these resources and you do not have the language, at some point you feel lost and alone, and that's a major challenge.
And if I could add that just for a sec, I won't belabor it, but we know that family accepting behaviors significantly reduce risk for suicide, depression, substance abuse. They boost self-esteem and overall well-being, even general health. And most conversion efforts happen at home.
Yeah.
Home can be a place where parents are trying to make that child less gender diverse, or tell them they're not who they are, or try to clip their wings, as it were, when they're very young. And that really sets off a chain of distorted sense of self and also impaired self-esteem that affects risk behaviors when they get older.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Krebs, and I run a support group for LGBTQ youth just a few miles from here. And I mention the Family Acceptance Project and the Trevor Project to the kids all the time. But on a personal level, what one thing should I tell the kids from you all?
Everybody go really quickly because we're over time, but I'm going for it.
Tell them that hope is so important and that families can get education and help to change the way that they're interacting with their child. And it's not always going to be the way it is now. And they need to go to somebody like you to help guide their families.
Sam?
There are amazing resources here in Washington, D.C., like the Gen Out Chorus of the Gay Men's Chorus of Washington, D.C., which I sing with, which is an amazing resource for local youth, but also remind them that they can't change what they never chose and should never be forced to consider that.
And Mary?
I would say to them that they matter, that they're important, that they're valuable, because I think sometimes we forget those very basic messages. And these youth who are so often ostracized from their families or pathologized in some way need to have people who are reinforcing that positive identity development and that self-esteem.
Let's thank our panel.
Next up, a session produced by our underwriter, Gilead, addressing the HIV/AIDS epidemic among communities most impacted. Please welcome to the stage Greg Alton, the Executive Vice President for Corporate and Medical Affairs at Gilead Sciences, and Tori Cooper, an HIV health educator at Positive Impact Healthcare Centers.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Is this on? Yes? Great. Well, really pleased to be here. Can't hear? Oh, there we go. As announced, I'm Greg Alton, the Executive Vice President of Gilead Sciences, and I'm here with...
My name is Tori Cooper. I'm an HIV health educator at Positive Impact Health Centers in Atlanta, Georgia.
Why don't we get started?
Wonderful. So, Greg, there have been a lot of advances in HIV treatment and diagnosis since the 1980s. So it can be easy for a lot of people to think that HIV really isn't on the national conscience anymore. Statistics and data are showing, however, that especially in the South, that's just not the case. So tell us a little bit about what Gilead is doing to the most impacted communities, LGBTQ communities, transgender women, particularly those of color, MSM, gay men, bisexual men.
So let me start on the first statement in terms of the advances that have been made in HIV/AIDS since the 80s. I'm from San Francisco, born and raised in California. Been at Gilead for about 20 years now, so we've seen tremendous progress, whether it's in San Francisco or whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, huge amount of progress. And for example, in San Francisco, as most of you are aware, over the last 10 years, we've seen an approximately 60% reduction in new infections for HIV. And that's driven by treatment as prevention, a lot of outreach, a lot of support services, PrEP, and other prevention. So it's been great to see. But as you point out, we have not seen the same progress in the South. The South still is too far behind. We have about 50% of new infections, 50% of the prevalence of HIV, and 50% of AIDS deaths in the South, despite being about a third of the US population. So there's clearly a problem there. And it's even worse if you look among the either black women, black gay and bisexual men, and the transgender community of the South. So we see the problem, and we've seen these statistics, and you asked the question, well, what to do about that? And that's a very good question. And we have some ideas.
So what do you think is driving some of the current trends?
Well, clearly, one of the things that we see, and we spent a lot of time talking with the groups in the South, stigma and discrimination, homophobia continues to be a big driver, we believe, of the challenges, but it goes beyond that. It's really complex. You've got just basic inequalities, you've got racism, you've got poverty. We have laws in the South that are discouraging for people.
Archaic as well.
Well, archaic as well, and so there's a lot of attitudes that are a problem in the South, and so I think a lot of people who are either at risk of having HIV simply don't feel the support or the love or the services available to them.
Thank you. And you mentioned the word stigma. Tell us a little bit more how you feel this stigma is really affecting the epidemic.
So, I was in, what clinic was that? I was in Birmingham, actually, not too long ago, and we're meeting with a great group. I think the name is Magic City in Birmingham. And we see the type of work that they're doing to reach out to the LGBTQ community, and the stories they tell us about people, young gay men or young gay boys who are afraid to say that they're at risk, to seek out prevention or PrEP services, or maybe not even aware of them, but because they know that they could be kicked out of their houses. They could become homeless very, very quickly. And what we see with this group is they provide a safe, comfortable, loving environment where people can go, they can be with people and cared for by people that not just look like them, but are like them and come from their same background. And it makes a huge, huge difference.
That's amazing. So would you say that stigma is one of the issues that's driving the epidemic, particularly in the trans community? And I generally say trans communities, because there are a number of different trans communities. And so yes, tell us a little bit about that.
No, I do. I think stigma is I mean, if you look at, trying to contrast, say, San Francisco, as I mentioned earlier, in the South, and I don't want to compare the two because there's a lot of differences, but, as I often say from San Francisco, we love gay people in San Francisco. There's it's totally normal. My kids go to school with, children of same-sex couples. They don't know any different. They don't think anything of it. And you contrast that to, what we see in the South, and it's completely different. And so just, imagine the difference of being in a community where you feel that you can be completely out, you're completely accepted, versus being in one where there's heavy discrimination, there's heavy stigma. Are you really going to feel comfortable going into the health system and saying, I'm gay, I'm at risk, or I'm transgender, and wanting to receive those services? It has a big impact.
So this isn't a question on our paper, but do you think that there's a lack of perceived risk within some of those communities?
Yes, I think there's either a lack of perceived risk or just a lack of understanding what the actual risk is and what's available. I think there also is, I personally believe that a lot of people just don't see that there are people out there that care about them. I think there's people that simply say, I am not liked, I'm not accepted by my community, and therefore there's almost a, not giving up, but just not seeking out the help that they could get.
Thank you for that. So tell us some other things that are working, particularly in LGBTQ community.
So what we see, and I spend a lot of my time dealing with barriers to access or barriers to care, is organizations in the community that are passionate about caring for people who are LGBTQ. You need those organizations are the ones that make the big difference. And what I can say is those organizations do exist in the South, and what they're missing are resources.
So I work a lot, mostly with transgender folk and transgender communities, and I keep saying that word because it needs to be said, particularly when we're talking about HIV and AIDS. So tell me some specific things that Gilead is doing.
So, we just announced our Compass Initiative yesterday, or actually the day before. I'm losing track of time. It's been a whirlwind. But, this initiative really came from a visit to the South. So I mentioned I was at Magic City. I also was at AIDS Alabama, and a bunch of Crescent City and others. And what we saw was, groups that are just passionate, dedicated, capable, just and doing an amazing amount of work with very, very limited budgets. And Doug Brooks and I don't know if you know Coreb, I think. Yeah, of course you know Coreb. We were out with June and her team, and we're just like we got to do something. We have to because Gilead, we have resources and we can do stuff. And these are organizations that we don't need to create something new. We just need to invest in what's already here. And so we came back, and Doug and the team kind of came to me a couple weeks later and said, Greg, you said you want to do something, right? I said, well, we have an idea. And what we need to do is we need to invest in these organizations. And they propose we do $100 million over 10 years. To invest in the South. I'm like, well, I'm totally supportive. Let's see what we can do. And we're able to push that through. And so what we're going to do with this Compass Initiative, we're going to support 3 coordinating centers, because we really want this to be about the South taking care of the South. So we don't want to be the ones choosing which groups we're going to work with and what they should be doing. They know what to do. And so we're working with Emory University Rollins School of Public Health, who's going to be working on capacity building and knowledge sharing of these grassroots organizations. We are going to be working with the Southern AIDS Coalition. I think Nick is here somewhere. And they're going to be working on education, awareness, and stigma reduction, again, supporting local groups in the South. And then finally, the University of Houston School of Social Work, who's going to be working on wellness, mental health issues, and the trauma associated with HIV, which I actually was able to meet with some of the patients that were being served by this group, and clearly mental health and trauma are huge issues among the community, and we need to deal with that.
Yeah, historical trauma is a huge issue that I think often we neglect to talk about when it comes to HIV and AIDS.
Yeah.
So thank you. So who are you going to work with? You just told us that. And how are these agencies going to use their expertise to work directly with their community partners?
Well, I mean, so they know the community, so the people that we're working with, they know a lot of these organizations, so they will make the decision. This is not going to be Gilead making these decisions, so it's going to be Emory, it's going to be Southern AIDS Coalition, it's going to be University of Houston, and they're going to be working with groups on the ground that, again, have these great capabilities, great desire, and as they even say, we need more resources. We want to do more. We want to save more people's lives. We want to prevent more infections because we're doing it now, but we want to do a lot more.
Sounds like some amazing things that Gilead's going to achieve with this initiative.
I'm really excited about this.
Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
For a look at LGBTQ refugees escaping persecution abroad, please welcome Lyosha Gorshkov, a Russian refugee and the co-president of Rusa LGBT, and Kamali Powell, the president of Rainbow Railroad. Back to lead the conversation, Allison Stewart.
So more than 70 countries criminalize LGBT people in one way or another, which obviously leads to people being in danger and in danger of violent life. Lyosha, you're from Russia. You were a professor there. After Vladimir Putin, after they passed that 2013 anti-gay law, which basically is propaganda, the propaganda law they called it, what was life like for you? And what was life like for you as an educator who was also teaching about sexuality?
It never was easy, even before 2013, but it was relatively free. There is no institutional criminalization of different activities in terms of queer studies. But when the law was passed and Federal Security Service gained the power, and they immediately called me out because I was deputy dean, I was doing queer studies, I was openly gay, and they invited me over. And basically, they were recruiting me to report on different students who are, as he said, communists, nationalists, homosexualists. So he perfectly knew who was I. And after that, he started following me, and I was chased by a right-wing activist group. I had to move from one apartment and hide myself. And for last 6 months, I was in Russia. I was using only private car, because it was not so safe. And one article came out eventually, and some right-wing activist group were demanding to fire myself for propaganda of sodomy at Penn State University. And that article our rector got. And it was already clear that I couldn't stay there, so I didn't tell anybody, of course. But it was the law oriented and focused on not protecting children, as it says, but on chasing people who are opposing the Putin's regime in terms of traditional values. So all of us all of a sudden became national betrayals. That's why I had no choice to flee the country.
For any of you who've read Masha Gessen's book, Lyosha is featured in it. I just want to read quickly so we have a sense of describing what it was like for you. Masha writes, gays had become public enemy #1 in Russia. Foreign agents, the foot soldiers of the looming American takeover, a threat to the foundational values of European civilization. Satan, pedophilia, American aggression, the death of the Christian civilization, and of course, the demographic threat. It was all about the gays now.
Absolutely.
Was that accurate?
It's all because even my students started calling me liberas. It's two words, liberal and tolerant person. So it's a very derogatory term to describe the person who protects and who promotes liberal values. So all of a sudden we became enemy of the state. And it's not only for Putin. Putin is distancing himself. It's about some people from the ground, from all of this far right sector, and Orthodox Church, which is empowered right now. And to me, it's very impossible to believe that for the last 5 years, the church has gained power because Russia has been atheistic country. So all of a sudden, everybody started believing God. And even though it's only 1% of population population who believed in orthodox values. So that's why to me it was amazing, because I've survived 3 political epochs in Russia: Soviet Union, Yeltsin's times in 90s and 2000s. So I know how it was in the 90s. So which culture becomes, yes, of course. Not my change, not
past 3 or 4 years decided to really establish ourselves as an organizational structure. And that gave us the fuel to help more people at a rapid clip. In 2015, we helped 29 people find safety. Last year was 81, and this year is 180 people. So far we've helped over 350 people find safety.
Yes. How do people find out about you, and how do you decide which cases to take, which ones you really think can be successful?
Yeah, it's difficult. You know, paying homage to the Underground Railroad. You know, we were a small organization flying under the radar until all of a sudden the Chechen crisis kind of plucked us from obscurity. But like the Underground Railroad, the more people that you help, the more people find out about you. And so, you know, we now have someone who, unfortunately, his full-time job is to hear the hundreds of stories of people who are all over the world facing persecution, stories like yourselves who are in immediate crisis. And so we're now over 1,000 requests this year alone. Wow. And it's a kind of confluence of opportunity and how. We tier our requests based on who has access to documents, where they're located, and where we can actually get them to safety. And so it fluctuates.
In terms of the Chechen crisis, one of the things that's interesting and bizarre about it, this idea that they are rounding up gay men and torturing them and then giving them back to their families and telling their families to honor kill them, is that the government is saying we don't have any gay people. So how are you able to go to the Canadian government and say, look, we have this issue, but the other government where it's happening isn't even recognizing it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It was funny to hear Kadyrov have that clip saying the gays aren't here, but if they are here, send them to Canada. And at that time, they were already in Canada. So it was the biggest piece. The strategy was to try to get as much information as possible. What's unfortunate about the state of kind of news media and instant sensational media is that when the Novaya Gazeta first published information, it was picked up by the New York Times, there was a lot of misinformation. And so the term gay concentration camp came out. And so you had this sense that there was a permanent detention facility and people couldn't get out. And so we actually had to find out on the ground what was happening. That included my own trip to Russia, where people had escaped to safe houses to hear firsthand what was going on. And once we realized that people were managing to escape through this route through our amazing colleagues at the Russian LGBT network, we then realized that we had a legitimate pathway to get them out. And we are, we're experts on verifying and understanding cases. So, rather, doesn't really matter what Kadyrov says. There are hundreds, thousands of people living underground as a result of this action. Very manipulative tactics to get these individuals to meet. So imagine if any of you are on an app and making arrangements to meet up with someone, and instead of meeting up with that person, you met up with an armed militia. They put a sack over your head, they throw you in the trunk of their car, and then you're beaten and tortured for the sole purpose of getting more names. And so it, and you mentioned Masha Gessen. Masha Gessen went to the region and did detailed reporting. There's a great New Yorker piece I recommend on it. And so it was that fact-finding mission, which is part of the work we do, which allowed us to kind of identify what was happening and compel the government to help act.
Are you ever concerned that you'll be infiltrated?
There is a reason why no one's heard of us up until now.
It's sort of a blessing and a curse, right?
Yeah, it was a big part of our mission and mandate was to try to do this work quietly. We thought long and hard about whether we should make any of what happened in Chechnya public, but we had this intense public interest and individual supporting from all over the world, and so we felt at that point, we had an obligation to inform the public that we had acted on this. But it's conflicting. It's conflicting whether it complicates the work we do for others now that we're so out in the open. But on the other hand, if it's given a beacon of hope for someone who's in a country facing persecution, then it might be worth it.
Leosha, you decided to come to the United States. Why did you decide to come to the United States, and what did you find when you got here?
So I was lucky because I already had open tourist visa, because otherwise I couldn't escape. And if I will tell somebody, they never will let me out. And when I got here, it was completely, it's devastation, because you have nothing here. You have to start over with your PhD there and your status there and all of your research. You have to abandon. You have to get over your life and start it over from here. And for a person who is always in the public spotlight and been teaching for a long time, it was months of silence. You didn't know anyone until you met some people from my Russian-speaking community, and I was engaged with Russian-speaking LGBT support group, and all of a sudden I found Russo LGBT organization, which I run right now. So, but it was totally understandable that I have to do something a part of my previous job. So, I was doing off-the-book job. I was distributing postcards in order to survive, because I don't get mistaken, because Russian professors don't earn money. There is no money. It's like my students who work for McDonald's, they make more money than Russian professors. So I came here without any money. So it was very tough. And but we filed our application for asylum, and I've been waiting for 2.5 years to get the interview. And it happened relatively like a couple months ago, not a couple months ago, 7 months ago, and I got my asylum only in March 2017. So from 2014 to 2017, I had been waiting that it could be done, my process and asylum. It's very frustrating for a lot of people who come, because I've been working for 3.5 years with people from all over Soviet Union republics. So it's very tough.
Yeah.
Believe me, it's like, and with our culture, our mentality, we are not used to be in capitalistic world. So that's why everybody who comes here, we are entitled to get it. So they don't have any idea that they have to move themselves forward, lift themselves up. And sometimes it's a problem that they settle down in Russian-speaking communities, which remain very homophobic and conservative.
I was going to ask you that.
Very homophobic and conservative. 70% of people coming to New York, they settle down in Brighton Beach area.
Yeah.
That's why it was my idea to launch the first Brighton Beach Pride on May 20th, 2017. We shake this house and we declare that we are queer, we are here. So, because, can you imagine, they come, thank you. They're coming from very hostile environment, when they were beaten up, were verbally abused, and they received the same treatment in New York, the city of diversity, salad bowl, melting pot, whatever you call it. So, and all of a sudden they go off the book to work, and employers humiliate them, verbally abuse them, and they have no idea they have law. They can address those issues to New York City government, because they're afraid of the police. Right. Because police is not your friend and not your ally in our countries. So that's why, and medical facilities, can you imagine, they come there, and people who've been here for 30 years, they still call them sodomites, faggots, and whatever. So that's why it was very necessary to launch that event, and we are going to continue. Now we have a huge backlash, but New York City all of a sudden has recognized us. We were given with proclamation of honor, blah, 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 but it's all of this, can I say bullshit? Because...
you did, so...
Yeah, so I apologize, because I prefer actions rather than words. Okay. That's it.
And last question, in terms of actions, how are you funded, the Rainbow Railroad?
So we're 100% privately funded, and so and we intend to keep it that way. It puts us in a stronger position to work with the government and others, but it's also our message to the community. If the international community believes that this work is possible, we'll continue going with the support. There was one individual, thank you, there was one individual in the US who launched a Facebook fundraiser in the middle of the Chechen crisis, and he helped raise $250,000 by 10,000 donors, and so it's the power of our community together that will help save lives.
Let's thank our panelists.
And now For a conversation about gays in the GOP, please welcome to the stage President of the Log Cabin Republicans, Gregory Angelo, and Washington Post writer, Jennifer Rubin. Here to lead the conversation is the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemens.
Gregory, thanks so much for joining us today. I am, and Jennifer, great to be on stage with you again.
My pleasure.
Greg, let me just open, and Jennifer and I are going to have some fun here and grill you. How good is it to be you in a Trump world?
A great question, but I would say it is pretty good to be not just Gregory T. Angelo, but to be a log cabin Republican right now. We have access to a number of arms of the Trump administration, cabinet secretaries, and even the White House itself. And for people who might actually be skeptical of a Trump administration, clearly we have some in the audience today, I think you need to understand that it's important to have those voices advocating on behalf of the LGBT community to people within this administration, because as the old saying goes, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. My pleasure to be here. Being me in the Trump era turned out to be a lot more exciting than I thought it was going to be. But I think
What is the actual name of your column?
The Right Turn blog at the Washington Post. I think all of us, whether gay, straight, Jewish, Christian, conservative, ex-Republican, have to make a choice, because it's a moral question, I think, not a political question that we've arrived at. And that is, to what degree do you cooperate and facilitate, enable an administration that you believe is not just politically wrong, but morally corrupt and to some degree evil? And I think people who went into the administration, many in the foreign policy community who we know quite well, had this same dilemma. Does a Jim Mattis, does a H.R. McMaster go into an administration knowing it's going to be a little bit of a shit show, or do they stay out because they really don't want to sully themselves by being involved? I have a Jim Mattis rule, by the way, which is Jim is allowed to stay so that we don't have a nuclear war. He's the only one. And everyone else can go. For me personally, the administration has crossed so many red lines of democratic norms, of human decency, of civility, of racism, of xenophobia, that I'm appalled. I go through life appalled.
So in Greg's role, and I have a lot of respect for log cabin Republicans, because I'm also believe engaging, all sides. Greg, I'm just sort of interested. I was there in Cleveland when President Trump said he was going to be the best president ever to the LGBTQ. He had to get that Q out.
What he said is he would protect the LGBTQ community from the hateful ideology of radical Islam. Right. That was the actual quote from the Republican National Convention.
No, that wasn't the actual quote. I mean, he said it was going to be the best president of the community in general. It wasn't just about radical Islam. Yeah, we can go back. I mean, I was there in the middle of it, and I was just astounded that he said it. So, we'll go back and we'll have a drink after, and we can check it. But
okay, deal.
You've said this administration is and I'll quote directly, the most pro-LGBT president in history, and I don't want to ridicule you. I just want to understand, because we've seen, the comments on the transgender ban, which Jennifer just raised very, very interesting questions about, the moral standing of this White House. I'm interested in where we are. I don't know if it's a fact or true, but I am understanding that members of the LGBT press corps were not invited to any of the holiday parties. That is something going on. I'll have to kind of check it out right now. So I'm just wondering, in that world, how do you navigate it? I mean, what are you trying to win, and what are your red lines? I mean, Jennifer laid out some of her red lines. What are some of your red lines as you see?
Well, first let me back up and talk about some of the pro-LGBT things that Trump has done. Trump is actually the first president of either party, Democrat or Republican, to enter the White House believing that marriage equality is the, quote, settled law of the land. We have President Trump maintaining a pro-LGBT non-discrimination executive order that everyone on the left was anticipating him to nullify maybe hours after he took office. We have in Trump an individual who is appointing openly gay individuals to key positions within his administration, including members of log cabin Republicans. These are all things to celebrate. But I do want to point out, getting to the latter part of your question, and for those folks who maybe aren't following the work of log cabin Republicans around the clock, I mean, we are not Trump apologists, and we are not people who are out there defending anything and everything that this president has said or done. In fact, I would say that we are the most consistent LGBT advocacy organization out there because we have praised this administration when praise is due, and we have criticized this administration when that criticism is due for things like rescinding the order for open service on transgender individuals in the military. We criticized President Trump and this administration for rolling back guidance for transgender students. And we, subsequent
Have you
to
talked
that,
to him about Roy Moore?
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because we put out a video that quickly went viral just on Friday urging, quote, good Christians to do what good Christians do, and that is to stand up for Christian morals and to reject Roy Moore. So no, we're certainly not standing with this administration in support of Roy Moore.
Jennifer, I know you're very pro-LGBT in your formulation of things. Where do you think the Republican Party is today in either locking down, those pro-LGBT views, or walking away from some things you thought were important?
Let me just pick up on one point, and then I'll get to yours. This is a variation of the but Gorsuch argument that many conservatives put forth. Yes, he's done all these horrible things. Yes, he's racist. Yes, he's a xenophobe. Yes, he's mentally unbalanced. But he's got tax reform or but deregulation. There has to be a point at which there is no justification for some of these things. Is that working better there?
Yeah.
Where there is no justification, because otherwise you accept.
Can we get a mic out here, please?
Otherwise,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you. Otherwise, you accept the clearly unacceptable. And there has to be a point at which you say nothing justifies this behavior. As to the direct question about the movement, for clearly the most bizarre relationship in American politics, you have a man who has no Christian virtues, who has made alliance with the so-called Christian right. I've written a lot about this. I think it reflects horribly on those faith leaders who have chosen to be political players, not moral and faith leaders of their flock. But that is probably his strongest alliance. You see it in all the polls. They're over 70%. Whatever he says, they're with him. Whatever he believes, they're with him. And he has bent over backwards to accommodate them on everything from transgender, where he gave them more than they were actually asking for, to obviously their litigation positions. So I think, listen, every political party, every group has tensions, but you can't have a tension so great that you're going to give the Christian right everything they want and yet also be good to the LGBT community. You can say, I'll accept them because I like them for X, Y, and Z. That's the but Gorsuch argument. But you can't say that those two things can be reconciled. Right. You can't be for Hitler and the Jews. You can't be for freedom and repression.
I just want to piggyback
go ahead, Greg.
On what Jennifer was saying, because it bears mentioning. I mean, yes, Donald Trump ran up the numbers with 81% of the evangelical vote. Staggering, far more than Mitt Romney got, certainly far more than John McCain got. But this illuminates the reason why log cabin Republicans or LGBT Republicans are important and necessary, because if you put all your faith into a single political party, your destiny is to be ignored by one and taken for granted by the other. That's what's happening right now with the evangelical community, where evangelicals feel that they have been so dismissed by Democrats that yes, they are going with someone who doesn't necessarily espouse the values that they purport to hold.
I'm going to hijack your panel. I take exception to that because that's an argument for normal political times. We are in abnormal, once in a lifetime, I pray, times when I am willing to make a pact with any Democrat who will oppose this president. I'm willing to vote Democratic. I'm willing to support them because the issues on which I disagree with people like Steve Clemens pale in comparison to the urgent issues before us. We're talking about the survival of democracy. We're talking about whether we maintain ourselves as a nation of immigrants. These are meta issues that are so far above the day-to-day. I'll go back to fighting with Steve Clemens and all my newfound friends. Yes, in fact, I pined for the time when I could argue with him about top marginal tax rates. It's not...
And believe me, we have.
It's not that important. The house is burning down. I'll argue about the wallpaper later.
So Greg, I love you too, Jen. You guys would not know how big of our fights have been in the past. But Greg, Greg, you know, the president has appointed someone I know, Rick Grinnell, to be ambassador to Germany, and he is a leading gay voice. I have respect for Rick, and I don't think he's been confirmed yet, but you know, he's an example of an appointee of an LGBT appointee in this administration. So I get that, and when I meet with H.R. McMaster or Jim Mattis or various people in the intelligence community or the national security community, you know, I feel like you do. I want them to sort of know everything they can, because these are life and death issues, and you know, somebody has to be in there, you know, engaging, and so I do engage and I do talk to them. But I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of a advocacy community, and I do believe strongly that I want to see a healthy Republican Party, and I want to see a healthy Republican Party that is actually a pro-civil rights Republican Party, and that understands about transgender rights and lesbian and gay. We're going to have a panel right after this with various members of the transgender community who are looking at this. But I have to say, compared to last year, when we had trans, you know, I feel like that world in trans area is so fragile that the ice is threatening to break. And I just find at some point I don't want to challenge your enthusiasm for Trump in the sense, but I want to understand it, because I don't understand how your enthusiasm remains as robust as it is, given the fragility that we're seeing hit a very important part of the LGBT community, perhaps other parts of the community.
Well, I mean, I guess speaking from a practical and I dare say realistic standpoint, let's actually look at where we are 13 months since election day of 2016, and about 12 months since the inauguration. Largely status quo. Right, largely status quo. The only tangible thing that we have seen change is a call for a rollback of the open service for transgender individuals that was a policy that was implemented at the tail end of President Obama's time in office. And again, I would underline the fact that any such rollback is something that Log Cabin Republicans has explicitly opposed. We have been lobbying the Department of Defense, et cetera. But we have not had federal LGBT non-discrimination protections. We're fighting to make that happen at Log Cabin Republicans, working in concert with LGBT organizations largely affiliated with the left. You're seeing leadership coming, not from the president on those issues, but actually from Republicans in the House of Representatives specifically. I think it's important to point out there's a gentleman by the name of Scott Taylor, a Republican from Virginia, freshman Republican, former Navy SEAL, and he made history this past year by being the first ever Republican to author and introduce a piece of LGBT non-discrimination legislation. It's called the Fair and Equal Housing Act. I'd encourage people to look it up. But in 2017, I think there are a number of individuals, whether they're in Log Cabin Republicans or not, who do not feel attacked in the way by the Trump administration that some on the left and even folks like Jennifer, I think, might be might be describing.
Let me-
There was a survey that came out today by Harvard Business Review that said that gay men actually earn more than their straight counterparts today, right? I don't believe that it was. I'm just talking about the numbers, and yes, there's some legitimacy to. I mean, I don't know the crosstabs on that survey, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I'm just saying that there is certainly a segment of the population out there in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender that does not feel that the sky is falling.
Jennifer, I mean, just as we wrap this up, I'd like to know from you how you as a columnist and a commentator look at this question of, we don't have a monolithic lesbian gay community. We don't have a monolithic political slant of the lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgender community. I am interested in what you would advocate for those communities in this time.
I think the problem with the position is it's too narrow and too selfish. You have to raise your eyes. If this president is attacking Muslim Americans, do you think LGBT people are going to be secure and enjoy full rights? If they are supporting for the United States Senate, vigorously supporting with money and everything, someone who preys on children and women, you think they're going to be good for the LGBT community? I don't. So I think we all have to stop thinking about our narrow, selfish little interests. I want a bunch of stuff too. I'm wildly pro-trade. I'm wildly pro-immigration. I'm a free marketer. But I'm going to put that aside because the house is burning down.
Cabin Republican almost.
Yeah, in better times I was.
We welcome
in better times I was, actually. And I'll take a little credit for having broken down CPAC and held the first LGBT panel that they ever permitted. We were given a little room in the corner, sort of a broom closet. But I think we have to think big picture. And what I would say to LGBT Americans and all Americans is there are some fundamental responsibilities and issues in a democratic society. Equality for all, the rule of law, a sane chief executive. And if you don't have those, nothing else matters. So I think we need a bipartisan, apartisan, nonpartisan alliance to deal with the threats to our democracy, to get this president out of office, and then we can go back to making a lot of these decisions, a lot of these debates.
Thank you. And I'm going to give you the last word, Gregory, in the sense, I want to, since you mentioned CPAC, Steve Bannon is a big player in CPAC. I know that Log Cabin has become a substantial part of CPAC.
Yep.
There's Milo
Which was a fight, by the way.
There. I'm sorry?
Which was a fight, as Jennifer knows.
Yeah, a real fight. I know Grover Norquist and others were real advocates. I know that Frank Gaffney and others were real opponents. I've watched that very carefully, how it went. But there are personalities out there like Bannon and Milo Yiannopoulos and the Breitbart crowd, the alt-right crowd, and I know you have views on that. How, when you look at Donald Trump land and the importance of Bannon, who's connected to so much of that, how do you deal with it? And are you willing to engage it?
I mean, I don't want to skirt your question, but I can't say Bannon is really top of mind. You're someone who doesn't even work at the White House anymore, who's clearly pursuing his own agenda. I would say that if the agenda is to blow up the Republican Party, that's certainly not something that Log Cabin Republicans would support. But if we're short on time, I did just want to add maybe on a high note here. We have I actually brought it with me. We received a letter just a couple of days ago. Let me see if I can get it out here.
From President Trump?
Not from President Trump, but almost as good. Almost as good. It's from Ronna McDaniel, who's the chairwoman of the RNC, the person who's in charge of the Republican Party today. We're also celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. We were founded in 1977. Thank you. It says, hello, Log Cabin Republicans. Congratulations on your 40th anniversary. Since your founding in 1977, you have proudly represented thousands of strong conservatives across the nation. As the nation's original and largest conservative organization advocating for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, the work you do is critical in supporting liberty and equality for all.
I'll skip ahead. Today we celebrate your decades of support for the LGBT community and its allies. On behalf of our party, we will continue to stand with the Log Cabin Republicans as you advance the ideals of freedom over oppression now and for years to come. Your voices make our party stronger and our nation greater. Chairwoman Rona Romney McDaniel.
Well, congratulations on that letter. I look forward to having people that support Roy Moore read the letter and know about it.
It's publicly available, you know, but I would just point out, you know, this is something that mere years ago would be unthinkable. Having the head of the National Republican Party formally recognize the work of an LGBT organization and do so in no uncertain terms, right? Explicitly say the RNC stands with Log Cabin Republicans in your work advocating for not just LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community.
And with that, thank you, Gregory Angelo. Thank you very much for showing up here
Thank
today.
you.
Gregory Angelo, President of Log Cabin Republicans.
Thank you,
Jennifer
Jennifer.
Rubin of Washington Post. Thank you both so much.
The future is in flux for transgender service members. Joining Steve Clemens for this conversation, please welcome Matt Thorne, the President and CEO of OutServe, Shannon Minter, the Legal Director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and President of Sparta and Navy Lieutenant Commander Blake Dremin.
You know, so it's, this is a very emotional day for me, right? I mean, isn't it an emotional? I mean, this is a weird day. A lot going on, a lot of passion. We've tried very hard to engage all sides of the debate. I remember that when we at the Atlantic felt very committed to bringing in an editorial platform to discuss LGBT issues. It's different than an advocacy platform. That means you have tough moments. I thought that we had made enormous strides in talking about the transgender community, bringing them in previous forums. I feel so worried about this world. And Commander, you're the highest ranking transgender service member actively serving in the U.S. military today. Talk me down. Should I not be worried?
So a couple of things with that. One, I'm definitely not the highest ranking.
Well,
we definitely have a few that outrank
just let me give you a promotion when yeah.
So,
your mom says you're going to be an admiral.
Yeah,
so.
my mother thinks highly of me. Probably more highly than I do of myself. But there's definitely some uncertain times, right? However, for the most part, service members have been fully integrated and are for the most part, fully accepted. There are pockets, obviously, within the services where you have unsupportive commanders, but those are a lot fewer than those that are being supported and working their way through their transition. There's some confusion with the policy, obviously, with regards to whether or not it's still in effect or who's eligible, what you're eligible for, and things like that. But that's not because the service members aren't supported. Everybody realizes the contributions that transgender service members make to the military, not because they are trans, but because of the jobs that they're doing and the jobs that they're filling right now. So it is uncertain, but at the same time, our service members are continuing to succeed and really do well now, especially now that they can do it openly.
Were you surprised when Orrin Hatch and people like Congressman Ken Buck, I tried very hard to get Congressman Buck here, as a Republican congressman from Colorado who just was robust in his support of transgender service. I think it's the only semi-progressive syllables he's uttered in a long time. He's out there, but I tried to get him hard to come over here, but he had a conflict. But were you surprised by the level of very surprising GOP support for you after the president's tweets?
Actually, I was. That level of support comes with meeting trans service members, and that is, from my understanding, what happened with a lot of the Republican congressmen that came out in support of us, is that they've met service members that are transgender from their districts that are currently serving. The other thing too is understanding what the military does and how removing service members who have done nothing wrong impacts overall unit readiness. Because now I've got a gap that I have to fill that can't just be filled overnight. There's training and preparations involved that bringing in a new person to fill that thing is. So that is big.
And let me ask both you and Matt, and Jen, feel free to chime in anywhere here. When I read the president's tweets that morning, I saw them immediately after he had put them up very early in the morning, and saw this. I thought, wow, again, I don't know, I'm not a transgender person, I'm not in service, but I thought, has he just created thousands of enemies within the military? I mean, do people feel? I mean, I wonder if this sometimes when the president was tweeting out the anti-Muslim hate tweets the other day, whether or not within our military ranks do we have people who no longer are they able to separate Donald Trump and service of Donald Trump as commander-in-chief from their loyalty and concern for the United States?
I'm going to hand that question over to Matt. That is beyond probably where I can legally speak as a service
go
member.
for it.
I mean, he is the commander-in-chief,
right?
So
you say that so enthusiastically.
Well, he's created thousands of enemies on his own, so we haven't had to provide any support there. But he is the commander-in-chief. But I do think just the military is just a microcosm of the country, right? So you have individuals who are conservative, and you have those who are liberal. So but the thing about the military is it's country first, mission first. That's what they're going to focus on. That's what they have been focused on. That's what they're going to do. I will say about the tweets that it is a massive disruption. It threw a whole bunch of chaos into DOD. DOD is very regimented, and these are our missions, these are our goals, these are what we have to go out and accomplish. And it's hard to do that when you have a president that's contradicting what you're actually trying to do, or throwing potentially 15,000 people and saying, I'm going to throw you out. And to Blake's point, you can't just kick individuals out and then expect people that are going to be ready to replace them. That's time and effort and education that has to go into getting those individuals ready for all of the levels of jobs that they're doing.
Shannon, I know the National Center for Lesbian Rights is one of the litigants you've filed in these cases. I know there may be more, but I know that there are at least 4 cases that are being litigated right now. What's the status of those? And as I understand it, there was some controversy where people thought, say, hold up, don't take legal action yet. I don't get that answer, but what is the logic in that debate and pressure that I know you've been facing over these cases?
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen with this president repeatedly on this issue and other issues as well is he'll do something like take an action that is terribly harmful and then try to sow a lot of confusion and muddy the waters so that people, rather than responding appropriately, just end up being confused. So we did face that struggle with the transgender military ban. That Trump was very clear. He tweeted the tweets and then in short order followed up with a very official memorandum that ordered the military, and he's commander-in-chief, to reinstate the ban on transgender service members. But then they also have this PR machine that started saying, oh, nothing's really happening, we're just looking at this policy. Meanwhile, there was a very clear presidential order, and it confused people. It confused people even in our own community. But that's why NCLR, and then I work with Jennifer Levi, who's the director of the Transgender Rights Project at GLAAD, who I'm sure many people know from the Obergefell case. We just thought it was so important to not be hypnotized by this, trick really, and to, act. So we filed a lawsuit, right away. But there are now 4 lawsuits. In short order, there were 3 others filed. Matt is an OutServe, has a lawsuit with Lambda that's filed in Washington State. The NCLR and GLAAD case is in D.C. We actually have another case in California, and then the ACLU has a case in Maryland. And we got 2 rulings already. The D.C. case and the Maryland judge have already issued preliminary injunctions saying that, at least for the moment, that Trump cannot enforce the ban.
A year ago when we held this, I had the privilege of interviewing Eric Fanning, who is
wonderful man.
So. Former Secretary of the Army at that point. Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense, had told me that if he could have, didn't have to get 2 nominations, then he would have made Eric Deputy Secretary of Defense. And when Ash Carter succeeded Chuck Hagel and came in, moving transgendered service forward in a big way. And I asked Eric on this stage a year ago, and some of you were here and remembered, I said, can these rights be rolled back? And he said, it can't happen. You just can't take rights away from people. Was Eric Fanning wrong?
I hope not, and we shall see. But you asked this question about what's the impact of Trump's statement on people in the military. This is extraordinary. This has never happened in our nation's history, that a president has attacked individuals who are currently serving our country, including people who are deployed overseas in Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea. I mean, that is a shock to the system for everyone in the military. An attack on some service members is an attack on all service members.
Matt, how do you feel?
I don't think Eric was wrong. I think, you know, up until June, this was not, DOD had no desire to roll anything back. We had worked with the Armed Services Committee in the Senate during now Secretary Mattis's confirmation hearing to get clarification on what he thought about our policies, not just on trans service, but we pushed them on a few other things. And there was no indication from DOD at all that this was something that they had intended to go about. This strictly came out of the West Wing, out of the White House, through a Twitter handle. But I don't think at that moment that Eric was wrong. It's not something, he has held so many different positions in DOD, from Chief of Staff to Ash Carter to Secretary of the Army. DOD's perspective is that they were going to move forward and that they were going to roll and continue to do the job that they're instructed to do. So in that perspective, no, I don't think Eric is wrong.
Blake, I was really intrigued reading about your promotion ceremony. Maybe I have this part right. You're the first out transgendered member of the military to be promoted.
Correct.
So that's correct. Got something right there. Congratulations. But what really intrigued me was when you were promoted. And I know your parents out there, I was reading about your grandmother having, driven a truck in World War II and then having been knocked out of the position because she was a woman. So I know that these issues run very deeply in your family, particularly about gender and service and whatnot. But I was intrigued that every member on stage, when you got promoted, every military member was a transgendered service member.
Correct. So
take us, give us that picture. And
so
how did that happen?
As we were moving towards designing the promotion, the implementation of the policy was happening October 1st. But I had been well out to my command for well over a year. So I wanted to kind of make it meaningful because they knew that I'd been working this issue since I had been there, and I wanted to make it meaningful to me because it was my promotion ceremony.
But you were winner of the Navy League's Vice Admiral Robert F. Batchelder Award, the Navy's highest logistics award for contributing to the operational readiness of the fleet.
Yes.
Sounds really big. Is it?
Yes, it's a big deal.
It is a big deal. It's a big deal.
It is the Navy's highest logistics award for junior officers. I did it I was awarded it for my work on submarines, which I was also one of the first, at the time, female-bodied personnel to integrate women on submarines in 2011. I did 5 strategic deterrent patrols. I've deployed 11 times, right? Everything that you could say about anything when it comes to transgender service, I've done it all, right? I've had medical procedures while on operational duty, in ways that didn't impact my mission readiness or the unit readiness. I've done consistent, always been ready to deploy, and unit cohesion has never been an issue. So when it came to time to do my promotion, I wanted to make it meaningful for me because it was my promotion and I get to make those decisions. So one of my closest friends happens to be, at the time, Major Bree Fram, and they will put on Lieutenant Colonel in January. And then Amanda Simpson, who also happens to be a mentor of mine, and I wanted her to be my promoting officer. And so I made sure that, if I was going to take time to take my ceremony and make a statement, that was going to be what the statement was. And that was, hey, we're all here, we're already serving, we're already doing it honorably, and we're going to continue to do it. And that was the message that I wanted to convey.
Let me just add, and congratulations. I mean, it was very powerful when I read that. I don't think we've ever had so much clapping at an Atlantic Forum before. It's making me nervous.
It does.
But I feel like, in a way, this is a feel-good story so far, and I just feel like most of the transgender story is not a feel-good story, that there are real stresses and strains. I know that you're litigating cases. I know that you're dealing with real-life crises out there among some of your members. And I'm wondering, to get beyond the military and these issues, as you look around communities, you said something very important to me, which was that unit readiness was not impacted and that your relations with your colleagues are there. But when you step out of some of these zones, are you able to influence the way the broader community feels about inclusion and acceptance and embrace of transgendered citizens?
Well, I think DOD has, not just on LGBT issues, but has been ahead of the curve with the country as a whole. The DoD desegregated the force before we had the Civil
Right.
Rights Act. Now we have women in combat, and we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and now we have open transgender service. I think it has had a tendency or the military has had a tendency of kind of leading ahead of the country and helping the country kind of come along with it. I think Blake and Shannon can.
Well, part of that happens to be that military service members are, based on the most recent Gallup polls, the most trusted job in the country, right? So when you talk about whether you're gay, you're straight, or black or white or whatever, people trust your judgment as a military service member. And being trans, that brings forward, hey, I can do those types of things. I'm not limited in my ability. I may not choose to join the military, but I'm not limited in what I can achieve. And that brings forth the idea that not everybody knows a trans person, but they might know a service member. And that service member likely knows a trans service member who they can interact with and come to an understanding for. And that understanding is what changes hearts and minds.
Thank you. Shannon and Matt, before I go to the audience or questions, if we were to get, you're both in civil society, you're advocating institutions, and I'm interested for you to achieve more of what you want to achieve, and we gave you the power to move a needle, the power to do something extraordinary to move the rights agenda forward. What do you most need?
Democratic Congress.
Yeah.
But is it, but to go back to, our friend from Log Cabin Republicans, isn't it important to have the Republicans on board? That's why I asked about Orrin Hatch, Ken Buck, some of these others, but.
Absolutely. We've had, John McCain has
Right.
sponsored legislation with Kirsten Gillibrand. We do have Republicans on board. The problem is quite frankly, the leadership in both chambers and the White House. There is no desire to move. We have two pieces of legislation that are sitting in the House and the Senate right now to basically codify open transgender service and protect trans service members. Where's Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell on moving that legislation forward? We have Orrin Hatch and we have Republicans that that are with us. Well, then the leadership needs to, recognize that this is a bipartisan issue now, and they need to bring the legislation forward.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah, absolutely. We need greater public education and support, but what transgender people need is just the chance to contribute and participate. You see what happens, and you see amazing individuals like Blake and these other transgender service members I am so honored to represent. They're extraordinary people. That is what's so powerful. Exactly what you said, Blake. The military is one of the few employers in our country that actually can, when they make a decision to get rid of some artificial barrier and let some previously marginalized group be integrated into the service, they do it, and they know how to do it. And that is the silver lining to this whole miserable fiasco that we're in right now, is our whole country is getting to know people like Blake and other transgender service members. And my hope is that it is going to actually transform the way our country sees transgender people more generally.
I don't mean this in any facetious way, so I'm maybe stepping on land. Did Caitlyn Jenner help this process or hurt it?
I would call it a neutral party.
Neutral?
Because, in all honesty, nobody in the military is going to listen to anything Caitlyn Jenner says. So, that may be true, but when you're talking military policy, they want to hear from military, military veterans or military people who've served in the past and things like that.
I think it was,
so,
quite frankly, for transgender rights as a whole, if you take our whole movement and focusing on transgender rights, it was the silver lining out of those tweets was Blake and the cadre of individuals that we had on CNN and MSNBC, because that picture needs to be painted.
Right.
Caitlyn Jenner can do what Caitlyn Jenner wants to do, but their work and what they're doing, that has advanced transgender rights far more than Caitlyn Jenner has.
Shannon?
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. I want people to see, the public to see people like Blake and the other plaintiffs in these cases and just transgender service members. Yeah.
I think it's great. Let me open up the floor. Questions, comments? We've got one right back here. Do we have a mic, folks? Where's the mic? Oh, we have one here. Sorry, I'm going to get to you. So, yes. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Sue Fulton. Organization, Women in Service Change Initiative. So I understand people view senior military officers, admirals, and generals as being very hidebound and very conservative. Can you talk a little bit about their reaction? Obviously, they met transgender service members during this process, and you know, what are they being dragged through this? Like, what's been their reaction?
It's great.
So our senior military leaders have been supportive throughout this process. Now, they didn't start out that way in many cases. And part of that had to do with the lack of education on what transgender meant and what it meant to transition in service. So as people like myself and others that we brought in, whether we were talking to company commanders, infantrymen, submariners like myself, and drill sergeants and things like that, to meet with those senior leaders to help them understand these are the people that you have. They're not some anomaly. They're doing the jobs that you need to be done. That definitely moved the needle into our favor. And the sudden issues with the policy have forced many of them to make public statements in support, because they're not interested in politics. They're interested in the people that are doing what they're doing.
Great, thank you. Yes. She'll hold the mic for you.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Joanne Fisher. Do not discredit Ms. Jenner. I am a veteran, and I want you to know she made a difference in the veteran community. There is no question, a statement. She made a difference in the veteran community for transgenders because of what she went through. She got 90% disability. When you come out, you come see us. I'm with the Joint Veterans Commission. I'm with all kinds of veteran organizations. We get you money for any kind of backlash. So that was it. So I'm sorry.
Thank you for your perspective. I appreciate it, because I'm interested in how people are perceived in this world, because we deal a lot with experiences, symbols, what's in the media, and I'm interested in those things that resonate to move this forward. And again, I feel like this is a fragile time. So I'm very happy to see the gains you've all made. Yes, right here.
Yep. My name is Justin. I'm with the government of Quebec, and I'm just wondering, the United States has many military allies. The majority of NATO countries do allow trans service.
I think there are 18, right? 18
is
nations.
Yeah, so how has, number one, the recent decisions of the United States military impacted your relations with NATO allies? And before even Obama's decision to allow trans, other nations is there a solidarity between the trans service members of NATO countries? Is there any lobbying on their parts?
Right. Blake?
So when the DoD did the original study, they did study the 18 allies that we partner with as far as how they did open transgender service. RAND was very adamant about using those experiences in their study. Whether or not this particular issue is going to damage NATO allies, this is not the issue that's going to do that.
Matt?
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think the decision today about Jerusalem, that has a bigger impact on some of those countries. But you know, you mentioned the Obama administration. You know, this was a DoD-led policy. DoD implemented this. Yes, it was Ash Carter, and he served under President Obama. But this wasn't this decision was DoD-led. This was not imposed on them by the Obama administration. The Obama administration just allowed them to develop this policy and come together and implement it on their own.
Shannon, does this issue of not necessarily relationship with allies, but the experience of allies that have open transgendered service and who have great success with it, does that influence the court cases that you're pursuing?
Absolutely.
And how you're framing them?
Absolutely, yes. As Blake noted, that was a key part of the RAND study that the military itself commissioned, and they looked at the experience, now the lengthy experience, extensive experience of other countries that have long had open service by transgender people, and help them reach the conclusion that it would be there's absolutely no reason not to do the same in the U.S. And yes, the judges that we're in front of in these federal lawsuits, you can bet that we're calling that to their attention. And Judge Kotar Katelli, who issued the first PI and preliminary injunction in right here in the district, noted that in her opinion.
Go ahead.
Really quick, Steve. I would also say I think that some of those countries are probably looking at us like, WTF, like, what are you guys doing? You know, so I think that like, as the United States, and not just on this issue, but on a number of issues, we're ceding our leadership to to some of these other countries.
A lot of what TF moments, or WTF. Do we have one more question? There, yes.
I can't hold the mic myself, apparently, but I will ask a question.
Sorry, it's my rule.
Thank you. It's not her rule. I'm Jim Forat. I come from 1969, the Gay Liberation Front, and I'm active in Rise and Resist and Gays Against Guns currently. I'd just like to step back for a moment. First of all, I want to say that everyone is entitled to work in the job that they're qualified for. That's my position. But this romance of military, which I hear over and over these days, is something that deeply troubles me coming from the politics that I do. And the whole question of binary identification, rather than breaking the binary and the gender, those are questions that I just want to throw out into the floor. I'm not asking any of you to answer me on that, but I think they have to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you very much. So the question, I think, is an interesting one, which is, I guess, Blake, this is towards you, and then also your members in OutServe. Is there a how do you feel about military service? I mean, this is one of the things where I think a lot of times that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the 60s community came out during the period of the Vietnam War, protest in some ways against the state, concern about being directed, and I think there's been a lot of change and fragmentation and, and evolution, but I'm interested in whether this is something that is discussed among your members.
We definitely have a cross-section of political views amongst even just the transgender military community and within the gay community, as far as the idea behind the romanticization of military service, as was put. We also have across the binary, or across the spectrum of gender represented within the military.
Right.
The military doesn't necessarily care that you're somewhere on the spectrum, as long as you show up to work in uniform in box A or box B based on what's in the paperwork. And open transgender military service gave you the opportunity to switch the boxes. But as far as falling onto the spectrum, they absolutely don't really care about that, as long as, again, you show up to work in either box A or box B. And you don't cross that without going through a process. So, and that part is because the military is very regimented, and we're not, as a culture, not ready for gender-neutral standards as far as physical fitness standards or military uniform standards. It's not something that we're ignoring, but we also realize at what point we can move forward and push the military in a certain direction, and when we can't. And right now, that we're still trying to get them to understand that you can switch boxes, much less move them across the spectrum.
Shannon, any quick thoughts?
Well, I just want to say I think there's a big difference between U.S. militarism, which has caused a lot of damage in the world, and the members of the U.S. military, who are generally wonderful, dedicated people who do really hard jobs and do lots of different things. Including, I mean, all the natural disasters that we've had recently in this country. That's who's on the scene there helping folks. And the other thing I would say about that is that that's why this case and this issue is so important. It's so critical that we hold the military accountable to democratic principles and to be accountable to our Constitution. That will help the military be a more progressive, constructive institution.
Matt, last word.
I grew up in a military family, and I think there's, a lot of the country has a misconception that, the military is about going to war and stuff like that. A lot of times, to Shannon's point, they're the first ones on the scene in natural disasters through our National Guards and our Army Corps of Engineers and others who get deployed. And quite frankly, the military is all about before we even get to, a war effort, it's all about getting things done diplomatically, or as much as we possibly can. And I, finally, I think military service or, through the Peace Corps, civil service is something that all Americans should really strongly take a look at. The military is not for everyone. There are other civil service options, but I think service in general is a good thing for this country.
Thank you. I just want to make an editorial comment of my own about this because I feel like it's so important. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of you for what you're doing in here. And I would say with regard to service in the military is I was in ROTC, in the Air Force ROTC in college, and I left because I knew if I signed that second-year paper with my scholarship, I would be at that point violating the law, put myself in real jeopardy and doing things, and it's always bothered me. And I have, from my experience of having, whether it's the health community or the financial community or first responders or the U.S. military or protest groups that are concerned about anti-gun activists, when you look at the LGBTQ concerns that we have here, among many people who have this, the fact is there are LGBTQ participants in every single one of those communities. And so I would say whether it's national service or whether it's protesting things the country does, there's an LGBTQ DNA element into that and everything. So that'll be my editorial comment. Thank you so much, Blake. Get this right, Blake Demon, the president of Sparta, and thank you for Sparta. Shannon Minter of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and Matt Thorne of OutServe SLDN. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, Blake, Shannon, Steve, and thank you to Allison and Matt and all of our speakers. This was quite an afternoon. I think of it as sort of a virtual tour of the biggest issues facing LGBTQ. We began with the Masterpiece Cake Shop and the CEO of Lambda Legal saying this is not about cake. I think that was pretty evident. And then we heard what I thought was a poignant and personal story from the florist who talked about her decision not to make flowers for the wedding of a valued customer. Wherever you land on these issues, I think what's important about what happened here today is that you were here, that you listened, and you listened closely, and that's really our purpose here. We got to hear, we were reminded that that conversion therapy is still legal in 41 states. We heard about gay pride in immigrant-rich Brighton Beach. My favorite quote of the day was, we're here in this salad bowl melting pot. And we closed the day hearing about the experience of transgenders in the military. I do want to thank our underwriters, Gilead and Kimpton, Mason, and Rook Hotel and Radiator for making this Atlantic Summit possible. Mostly I'd like to thank those of you in the audience. I know certainly all of you are incredibly busy. Your time is so precious, so I'm really grateful that you spent so much of it with us. I hope you felt like it was a meaningful afternoon. I'm standing between you and a cocktail. It's a dangerous place. It is a dangerous place to be, but I'm going to ask you one favor before you go, and that is in your chairs when you arrived or in an email from me, you will get a quick survey asking for your take on this afternoon. Your opinion really matters to us. We read these carefully. We take note of what you say and what you suggest, and it really informs how we do this work in the future. And now we hope that you will join us for a reception just down the street, which will begin very soon at the Kimpton, Mason, and Rook Hotel. It's around the corner on Rhode Island Avenue between 14th and 15th Street, and we'll have beer, generously donated by Miller Coors. The address is on your agenda, but we have lots of staff flooding the zone, so if you get lost walking half a block, they will be there to guide you. We'll have more conversation, cocktails, food. Have a wonderful afternoon. Hope to see you there. Thank you for joining us.